Jeremy, we first met several years ago around a conference on the question of torture. And that was obviously a concern of yours that really led you to a very public stance on that question, but it was also informed by your scholarship as a philosopher, as a legal and political philosopher. First, what were the concerns you had as a philosopher that made you take a public stance on this question?
As a philosopher, I suppose the concerns were how to think about moral absolutes and how to think about the possibility that we might want to articulate in the strongest possible terms a clear prohibition on torture. And not just articulate it, but ground it, think about its basis, think about the reasons that would lead people to stop doing the kind of consequentialist calculations and start to think about matters of principle in this regard.
We moved from that in our own conversation to agreeing to set up together with Robin Lovin a working group of scholars in different fields to think not so much about these pressing, urgent moral issues and issues of policy and torture and human rights, but a more fundamental theoretical inquiry into the nature of international law itself. Why were you willing to make that move and lead this group?
Well, I was already thinking about some international law issues, quite apart from torture, just thinking really about the philosophy of international law. So in my own thought, I'd been approaching that anyway. But like other members of the initial group, there was a sense that we were worried about the normativity of international law. We felt that announcing that something was a violation of international law wasn't being felt as conclusive or as even persuasive in the political community, in the country at large, in the way that one would, as a lawyer, expect. And there were many doubts being expressed about international law among scholars, including among my colleagues. And I wanted to be able to think those issues through. So the group offered a fabulous opportunity in grim times to think those background issues through in a very thorough and thoughtful way.
The host of this conversation, this working group, was a centre of theological inquiry, and at the heart of the conversation were not only distinguished legal philosophers like yourself and international lawyers like Mary Ellen O'Connell, but theologians and ethicists of the stature of Robin Lovin. Why were you open to the theological conversation to help you think through, as a philosopher, these questions of normativity in international law?
It wasn't just a matter of openness, it was a scary prospect, because this was an area in which I had dabbled only very slightly and had no formal training. Open to it, of course, partly because of my own faith and my own sense that church people were not thinking as clearly and as publicly as they ought to be thinking about these issues. But also my own faith had brought me to reflect on these matters from a Christian perspective. And so I thought, when this possibility was offered, that it would be a fine moment to integrate some of the concerns of my own Christianity, help them grow under the tutelage of my elders and betters in the theology profession, and bring those forward with the thinking that I had been doing for 20 years about the nature of law and the nature of legal obligation. I had been working over the years on political theory, and in the history of political thought, the theological dimension is never very far away. So there was also that present in my approach to these matters.
But this was, in that sense, a bold move, because that theological contribution, which has been there historically and intellectually in the history of political theory and indeed international law, has not been prominent more recently. Do you think this group has been wrestling with that challenge to bring a theological voice back into these wider deliberations?
I think we have. I think we've been wrestling with the challenge, responding to a call, might be another way of putting it. And in a funny way, while we have been doing this at the center at Princeton, one becomes aware all around us that others in different ways and on different other institutional bases are beginning to appeal to their faith or to show an interest, even if they are not men and women of faith, they're showing an interest in religious arguments. And that has been happening, and I've been conscious even over the last 5 or 6 years that there is an increase of that, particularly in American political thinking and in political theory and legal philosophy more generally.
So this group has been timely in that sense, as providing a space for this quite serious, high-level thinking across the disciplines on these questions.
I believe that's so. When I speak to my secular colleagues, or to my colleagues belonging to other religions, when I go back to New York University Law School, or back to conferences of political theorists or legal philosophers, and I say what I'm doing with this group, it's not met with a blank stare of incomprehension that it might have been met with, say, at the beginning of the 1990s. And so there really has been a movement, and I like to think that we've been, I think, in advance of that, but the impulses that have driven us to this conversation at the Center for Theological Inquiry are also impulses that others have felt in other ways, and I've been very, very happy that there has been that convergence.
How would you describe the character of the conversation that you've been leading here over the last several years with a group of legal philosophers, international lawyers, ethicists, theologians? What has been the quality of that conversation that you found helpful in your own work as a legal philosopher?
Yes, the determination, the resolution among the 9 or 10 of us to make this conversation deep and demanding. The work we do is quite hard. We concentrate for hours on end. We read and grapple with difficult papers. We're determined to argue robustly and clearly, but we have a very great respect for one another. And we teach each other things, not in a formal didactic way, but by listening and grappling with ideas that come from a discipline adjacent. So I listened to Mary Ellen O'Connell talking to me about international law, which is her professional focus, and then from disciplines that are a little bit more distant, when Robin Lovin or Esther Reed are talking about in the demanding vocabulary of modern theology. And the amount of goodwill with which people have brought that deep, complicated knowledge to the table to share with others has been the most distinctive feature of the conversation. If I may add one other thing, everybody involved in this conversation has kept their eye on the ball of what we are doing. There's a natural tendency that these groups would become centrifugal, that people would fly off in pursuit of their own agendas. One way or another, we've managed, everybody comes with their own perspectives. One way or another, we've managed to keep our eye on what we are doing together at the very time in which we are making our distinctive and disparate contributions to it.